In the chaos of war, a single hillside is rarely worth a footnote in history. But on one frozen, forgotten slope in the winter of 1944, a hill became everything. It was an anchor for an entire battalion's retreat, a collection point for the shattered and the bleeding, and the stage for an act of courage so profound it defies belief. The order was simple: hold. But the man tasked with holding it was not a rifleman, not a machine gunner, not an officer. He was a medic, armed only with a pistol, a bag of bandages, and an oath to preserve life. He faced an onslaught meant to destroy it. This is the story of when one medic held a hillside alone, and how he saved 100 men in 10 hours. Our story unfolds in the brutal final days of January 1945, along the icy stretches of the Western Front. Specifically, we are in the Alsace region, near the town of Holtzwihr, France. Here, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, battle-hardened and weary, is engaged in the grueling task of reducing the Colmar pocket, a stubborn German salient threatening Allied lines.
The unit at the heart of our tale is Company B, 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. They have just completed a punishing, successful attack on the town of Holtzwihr itself. But success on this front is fragile and fleeting. German forces, elements of the 708th Volksgrenadier Division supported by fanatical troops from the 2nd Mountain Division, are already preparing a fierce counterattack. Their objective: to retake the town and the commanding high ground to its east, a modest, snow-dusted rise known simply as Hill 616. Commanding the defense of this critical flank is Company B's commander, but his force is spent. The attack cost them dearly in men and ammunition. Dozens of wounded from his own company and others litter the battlefield between the town and the hill. The company must consolidate, tend to its wounded, and brace for the inevitable German response. He needs a secure casualty collection point, a place where the wounded can be gathered, treated, and prepared for evacuation to the rear. He chooses Hill 616. And to oversee this vital, vulnerable post, he chooses Private First Class James, Doc, Carson, the company medic. Carson, a 22-year-old from Ohio, was known not for aggressive bravado, but for a calm, unwavering dedication to his comrades. His job was to save lives, not take them. But on the morning of January 25th, the lines between those two duties would blur into an unimaginable test. The stage was set, the wounded began to arrive, and on the horizon, German observers were already plotting their move. The first hours were a race against time and suffering. Carson, aided by two less experienced aid men, worked frantically. They transformed a shallow depression just below the hill's crest into a crude aid station. Wounded men, suffering from shrapnel wounds, compound fractures, traumatic burns, were carried or dragged in by exhausted litter teams. Carson moved from soldier to soldier, applying tourniquets, administering sulfa powder and morphine, offering words of reassurance. By 0900 hours, nearly 40 men were packed into the hollow. The mortar fire was a prelude. Through his binoculars, a German commander coordinated the next phase. By 1100 hours, Carson, peeking over the lip of the hollow, saw movement in the tree line 400 yards to the northeast. Not just infantry, the unmistakable, hulking shapes of two German Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns, turretless tank destroyers armed with potent 75mm guns. They were grinding forward, infantry in field gray uniforms skirmishing ahead of them, using the scattered pine trees for cover. A force of at least 60 German grenadier was advancing directly on his position. But the strategic view from Hill 616 was a two-way street. As Carson worked, German spotters in the woods to the north and east had a perfect view of the activity. They saw the gathering of men, the movement of litter bearers. To them, Hill 616 wasn't an aid station, it was a ripe target, a concentration of American resistance, or perhaps a command post. The decision was made: it must be neutralized. The first sign of the coming storm was the whine of incoming shells. At 10:30 hours, a barrage of 81mm mortar fire began to walk up the southern slope of the hill. Dirt, snow, and frozen earth erupted around the aid station. The concussion was deafening. Carson shouted for everyone to keep low. One of the first rounds landed directly among a group of newly arrived wounded. The 2 junior aide men were killed instantly. James Carson was now alone. Carson's mind raced. He had over 50 wounded men now, completely incapable of movement. The company in Holtzwihr was under its own pressure, likely unable to spare a single platoon to reinforce him. Retreat was impossible. Surrender would mean captivity for him and certain death or neglect for his severely wounded charges. He was a medic, but in this moment, the Hippocratic Oath met the oldest law of the battlefield: protect those in your care, by any means necessary. He scanned the weapons around him. Among the wounded were rifles, a few cartridge belts, and crucially, 2.30 caliber M1919 Browning light machine guns that had been dragged up with a weapons squad earlier. One was damaged, the other appeared functional. Carson knew its operation in theory, every soldier did. But theory was about to meet a horrifying, practical exam. He saw 3 paratroopers moving toward a cluster of pup tents, their bayonets fixed. Anderson fired his pistol again. One man went down. The other 2 dove for cover and began firing back at his position. Bullets whizzed overhead, thudding into the dirt bank behind him. He was pinned. He looked at his pistol. He had maybe 2 magazines left. Against a company of elite German paratroopers, it was a hopeless equation. Then, he remembered the wounded. Not just as patients, but as potential defenders. He crawled to a corporal with a shoulder wound. His shooting arm was fine. "Corporal, can you fire a rifle?" The man, pale from blood loss, nodded. Anderson scrambled out into the open, a mad dash under fire, to where a fallen perimeter guard lay. He snatched the man's M1 Garand and a bandolier of clips, and slid back into the ditch. He handed the rifle to the corporal. "Watch that tree line to the left." He repeated this act twice more, arming 2 other wounded men who could still hold and aim a weapon. He created, in essence, a last-ditch defensive pocket centered on the most critically wounded. Sound of sporadic, determined rifle fire from the American ditch, mixed with German fire. Narrator. The fighting became a brutal, intimate stalemate. The Germans, surprised by the fierce resistance emanating from what they assumed was a soft target, became more cautious. They couldn't simply overrun the position without taking casualties. Anderson moved like a phantom, darting from one end of his makeshift strongpoint to the other, firing his pistol, directing the fire of his improvised squad, and simultaneously trying to staunch bleeding and ease pain. He used bandages from fallen men, administered the last of his morphine, and spoke words of desperate encouragement. "Hold on, just hold on, someone's coming." He didn't know if that was true. For all he knew, the entire battalion had been wiped out. Inside the bunker, Captains Miller and Gaines could only listen to the hell unfolding outside. They could not open the door. They could not stop their surgery. The fate of every man in the clearing rested on the shoulders of one 23-year-old medic from Ohio, armed with a pistol, a few rifles, and a sheer, unbreakable will that refused to accept the massacre of 100 helpless men. As the afternoon wore on towards 1500 hours, Anderson's situation was becoming critical. Ammunition was running low, his ad hoc squad of wounded defenders was tiring, their initial surge of adrenaline fading into agony and exhaustion. The Germans, realizing the resistance was isolated, began to coordinate a final push. Anderson could see them gathering for an assault from the north and west. He had perhaps minutes before they overwhelmed his position with a concentrated rush. He made a decision. He would have to gamble everything on one audacious move. He turned to the corporal with the M1. "Give me covering fire, as much as you can. Aim for movement, not to hit, just make them keep their heads down." Then, ignoring the corporal's protests, Anderson did the unthinkable. He stood up. In full view of the German positions, he did not run for cover. Instead, he walked with a deliberate, almost reckless calm toward the center of the clearing, where a destroyed supply jeep smoldered. His intent was not to be a hero. It was to be a target. A distraction. He fired his pistol toward the German positions, not aiming, simply making noise. He shouted, not in English, but in the few phrases of German he'd picked up. "Kamerad, surrender. You are surrounded." It was a breathtaking bluff. He was one man, claiming an entire American company was about to counterattack. For a few, crucial seconds, the German fire slackened. They were confused. Was this man insane, or was he the advance scout for a relief force? In that momentary hesitation, fate intervened. From the south, along the jeep trail, a new sound erupted. Not the crack of rifles, but the deeper, heavier roar of a .30 caliber machine gun and the distinctive bang 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 of a tank's main gun firing canister shot, a giant shotgun blast designed for anti-personnel work. A platoon from Love Company, reinforced by a single, precious M4 Sherman tank that had miraculously navigated the forest trail, had finally fought its way through. The German paratroopers, now caught between Anderson's stubborn defense and a fresh, armored American force, had no choice. Their assault broken, they began to melt back into the forest, dragging their own wounded with them. The Sherman's machine gun hosed the tree line, and the German resistance faded as quickly as it had appeared. Anderson, his body shaking with adrenaline and spent terror, lowered his pistol. He watched as the Love Company infantrymen swept into the clearing, securing the perimeter. He didn't celebrate, he simply turned and walked back to the ditch. He knelt beside the first wounded man he saw and began checking his bandage, his hands now beginning to tremble uncontrollably. The medic had returned. The battle was over. When the final accounting was done, the cost was horrifying, yet the salvation was miraculous. Of the 105 wounded men present at the aid station when the attack began, only 3 were killed during the overrun, a tragically low number given the ferocity of the assault. 17 of the makeshift perimeter defenders and litter bearers were killed or wounded. German casualties were estimated at over 20, with the destroyed machine gun nest and Anderson's determined defense taking a significant toll. But the numbers alone don't tell the story. Every one of those 100 wounded men who survived did so because one man refused to let the sanctity of his aid post be violated. Richard Anderson had, for nearly 2 hours, acted as combat commander, triage surgeon, and frontline defender. He had blurred the lines of the Geneva Conventions not out of aggression, but out of an ultimate, profound commitment to its highest principle, the protection of the wounded and helpless. For his actions on November 26, 1944, in the Hurtgen Forest, Private First Class Richard Anderson was recommended for the nation's highest award. He was not a commander leading a charge, but a healer making a stand. The Medal of Honor was deemed for actions of active combat leadership. Instead, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The citation detailed his armed defense, his redistribution of weapons, his fearless exposure of himself to draw fire, and his unwavering medical care under direct enemy assault. Narrator. After the war, Richard Anderson returned home. Like so many of the greatest heroes, he rarely spoke of that afternoon in the forest. He had not seen himself as a warrior, but as a medic who had simply done his duty to his patients, by any means necessary. His story, buried in the archives of the horrific Hurtgen campaign, exemplifies a different kind of courage. Not the courage of the attack, but the deeper, more resilient courage of the shield. The courage to stand firm when everything is falling apart, to protect life when the machinery of war exists solely to destroy it. The legacy of Doc Anderson is a testament to the fact that in the very heart of the death factory, humanity, armed with nothing but will and a .45 pistol, could still hold its ground. Narrator. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story not of grand strategy, but of individual resolve in a single, forgotten clearing. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. He would dash back to the wounded, check on the most critical, reassure them he was still there, and then return to the fray. He used his medical knowledge in a grim new way, aiming not to kill, but to wound, knowing a wounded enemy would tie up the resources of 2 others. But the pressure was relentless. The German commanders, furious at the hold-up, committed more men. A third assault gun arrived. By 13:30 hours, Carson was facing down a company-sized force. His machine gun ammunition was dwindling. He was down to his last few rifle clips. And then, the decisive moment came. A German squad, using a fold in the ground, had maneuvered to within 30 yards of his right flank. They rose as one to rush his position. Carson spun, raised his pistol, his last resort, and prepared to meet them. It seemed the 10-hour ordeal would end here, in a final, desperate close-quarters fight. What happened next was a combination of Carson's ingenuity, the terrain, and sheer, blind fortune. As the German squad rose to charge, Carson did not fire his pistol at them directly. Instead, he spotted the team leader, who was carrying a distinctive backpack, a Funksprectorate, a portable radio. In a split-second decision, Carson aimed and fired. His shot struck the radio operator in the shoulder, spinning him around and smashing the critical equipment. The loss of immediate communication with that squad caused a crucial, minute-long hesitation. In that window, Carson's ears, attuned to every sound on the battlefield, caught a new noise from the southwest. It was the deep, throaty rumble of American tank engines. Unbeknownst to him, a platoon of M4 Sherman tanks from the 756th Tank Battalion, having fought through resistance in Holtzwihr, was finally pushing forward to support the infantry's flank. Seeing the stalled German infantry so exposed on the open slope of Hill 616, the Sherman commanders acted swiftly. Their 76mm guns boomed. High explosive shells began bursting among the German assault groups with devastating effect. The German infantry, now caught in a murderous crossfire between Carson's stubborn defense and the arriving American armor, began to falter. But the German assault guns were still a lethal threat. One of them traversed its gun toward the new Shermans. Carson saw this. He knew he had one last card to play. He scrambled to the damaged Browning machine gun. Though it couldn't fire, its tripod was stable. He mounted his last functional rifle onto it, using the tripod as a crude but steady sniper's rest. He took aim, not at the Sturmgeschütz's armored hull, but at its commander, who had risen from his hatch to get a better view. Paused. Carson squeezed the trigger. The German vehicle commander slumped.